Now at this point in our story, we've got a fork in the road. We've got the popular art form of the time, which of course is abstract expressionism. New York City is the hub of the art world at this particular point. Most galleries that you walk into, you're going to see some variation of this form of art making. Lots of important artists, some of which we got to see last week. But this week, like I say, fork in the road. And what we're going to have are people that are going to decide, what is it that we like about painting? Is it this idea of breaking down the image, breaking down what we expect of a painting, the avant-garde explosion of throwing out one rule after another? Well, one group of artists are going to sort of continue down this path, continue taking more and more out of the art. They're going to slowly take away expressive gesture, creative line making and mark making and creative explorations in how the art's going to happen. And the artwork is going to get thinner and thinner, and there's going to be less and less in there until we're going to get to this blank white canvas, right? What some people will refer to as the end of painting, the death of painting. We're going to call the artists that pursue this path minimalists. On the other end of the fork, you're going to have artists that want some of the images back. They want to see recognizable things, and in fact, they want to reference what's going on in pop culture at the time. The fact that if you flip through that magazine about Jackson Pollock, more than 2/3 of it is advertisements, and the fact that these advertisements are everywhere. They're on the street, they're in the books, they're in the magazines, they're everywhere. And because they're everywhere, the artists feel it's necessary to at least reference them. Those artists we're going to call the pop artists. Probably one of the most famous of the pop artists is probably Andy Warhol. He's probably the one artist, if you know anybody from the pop era, that's in your brain. Andy Warhol became a household name through a number of very calculated sort of moves. He was able to sort of explode and then stay relevant for quite a long period of time. Sort of similar to an artist like Picasso, who at least at this time was still active, was still doing his stuff in Europe. But he was still doing the old art, and Andy Warhol was trying to explode and create a new American art. But he was not the only one in New York City that was doing this sort of artwork. There was a number of artists that sort of accidentally, sort of simultaneously stumbled upon this exploration, partly because it was so obvious. An obvious avant-garde move to react against what was going on in the galleries and the museums at the time, which was abstraction, extreme abstraction. Absolutely almost complete abstraction. So what would an avant-garde artist do if that was the popular thing? Well, they would make images that had things in them, recognizable things. It seems very obvious now because we've lived with these images for 60 years. But at that time, they were extremely avant-garde. You don't walk into a gallery and see advertising. You don't walk into a gallery and see the American flag. And in fact, that's sort of the last place that you would expect to see an American flag at this particular time. If everybody is sort of, loving being an American post-World War II, well then the avant-garde artists are probably not going to be super into that. Unless, of course, you're a super avant-garde artist, an extremely avant-garde artist, in which case you're being ironic and you're bringing that sort of thing in. You'll see Jasper John's famous American flag paintings, and you'll see Andy Warhol's famous soup can paintings. Both things totally the last thing you'd expect to see in a gallery, especially in that abstract expressionist moment. One of my favorite moments in the Andy Warhol story wasn't necessarily the Campbell's soup cans. They were subversive. They were avant-garde. I get it. He actually made 32 different varieties, one for every type of Campbell's soup that was on the market at that particular time. He said, I eat soup every single day. This is part of my life. Let's just sort of celebrate that in the same way that we would celebrate a king, or the same way that we would celebrate Jesus, or whatever. But that's not necessarily my favorite moment in the Andy Warhol story. It was actually when he took the concept one step further, and he actually reproduced a perfect reproduction of the Brillo box, right? Now the difference, in my opinion, between the Campbell's soup can and the Brillo soap pad box is the simple fact that the Campbell's soup cans are actually flat paintings, prints, whatever you want to call them, on a piece of paper. And in fact, if you look at them, they're very flat and they're very stylized. they're not even necessarily going out of their way to really fake 3D on a 2D plane. It's a simplified version of the Campbell's soup can. However, the Brillo box, these are almost exactly the exact same thing that the factory produces. They're three-dimensional. They could hold Brillo soap pads. They're actually a reproduction, a mechanical reproduction made by an artist of something that's being made by factories or by the popular culture, and with the advertisements on the side of the box and everything, right? These are exact duplicates. And I think that that actually crosses over into some new territory. It's really pushing that boundary pretty hard with the idea of making art out of pop culture to actually perfectly reproduce something from pop culture for the sake of discussing it as a sculpture. Remember last week I was talking about the fact that there were a number of gallery curators, critics, artists that immigrated to the US during the World War II, sort of set up shop in New York and began doing this process here. One of the key ones and one of the most critical ones to today's conversation was a gentleman named Leo Castelli. He set up a gallery in New York City, and he was one of these really important tastemakers. He was involved in showing surrealism and abstract expressionism, and eventually the art movements that we're going to be discussing today, pop art and minimalist art. But he was also sort of critical because he didn't just sort of wait for the art to come to him. He was also quite proactive in searching out, trying to see what was happening in New York City, and trying to see if he could have anything to do with sort of guiding it, steering it. One of the things that I find to be extremely interesting is that a lot of what we know of as pop art, a couple of the key characters being Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Roy Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol. Leo Castelli was sort of looking around, and he sort of saw that several of these artists were pursuing sort of similar things. He actually saw that, that there were several people that were playing with comic books, for instance. And when he saw that there were several people exploring this, he started bringing some of these folks together, collecting a couple pieces from each and sort of saying, all right, we're starting to see the beginnings of something here, and let's sort of see what can happen with this. And when somebody sort of sees this happening and sort of galvanizes sort of a form around that and can sort of be able to begin talking about it and can be able to begin getting critics to write about it and begin the process of showing this artwork, then all of a sudden something goes from just a blip or several various blips to being pulled together to create one large blip, something worth discussing. Now again, as I spoke about a little bit last time, which I want to go into more detail now, there's a big difference between how art movements sort of formed and evolved in the classical era or in the Renaissance era or in the 19th century than how they evolve in the 20th century. In the 20th century, you've got art movements just popping and exploding. In some cases, every 3, 4, 5 years, every 10 years, there's suddenly a new name for what's going on. And this new name is a derivative of or an exact opposite of what was going on just previously. And a lot of this comes from the fact that you've got mass production of literature and mass production of magazines and newspapers and art-specific sort of journals that are being produced and that are competitive, and these galleries that are being produced and that are competitive against one another, and they're each sort of looking for what is the next big thing. And because they're actively looking, and because everybody is sort of pursuing this avant-garde art approach, they're intentionally going out of their way to try to stab in a new direction and pursue something that isn't just what was going on last week or an improvement on it, but perhaps something that is completely the opposite of it. And because you're going completely the opposite, you're going to end up with something that's going to evolve much quicker. You know, instead of just saying, all right, well, that was good, let's just improve on it a little bit, or improve on that a little bit, or just reshape it a little bit. But instead, let's completely 360 and push it into another dimension. Let's completely try something the exact opposite, and this creates a totally different evolutionary moment in art. And in my opinion, one of those key players in that is Leo Castelli, in the way that he would not just show the same type of art forever. A lot of the galleries in Chicago sort of take one of two approaches. They either collect an artist and then just sort of show that artist until they either retire or die. Or you've got the other type of art gallery where it's like every single month it's a completely different show. Now Leo Castelli was somewhere in between. He definitely kept and maintained relationships with certain artists over a lengthy period of time, but he didn't just stick to one style forever. He was constantly reinventing what his gallery was about, and therefore constantly reinventing what the New York art scene was all about. That's a painting. Qualifies on at least some level. Follows at least a couple of rules. Breaks a lot of other rules. But this guy said it was a painting, so it's a painting. That's how the avant-garde works. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad painting, or that these aren't all equally great, or not great. Taste is only one principle when we're discussing painting, and it's not necessarily universal taste. Perhaps if we're talking universal taste, we're talking more pop art, right? This is probably much more academic art. Art about art. This is a painting about the history of painting on one level or another. Because you're not going to arrive at this unless you were in the previous art movement, the abstract expressionist art movement, which of course was impacted and affected by something like the Dada art movement. Just impacted and affected by things like the Impressionist art movement. Looking at minimalist art doesn't really work unless you understand the artworks that came before it, and the idea of artworks slowly breaking down that level of realism to the point of abstraction, and then breaking down abstraction to the point of minimal or completely empty, right? Though I wish it was easy and you could just put every individual artist in a particular time period, a particular art movement, in a particular little pigeonhole, unfortunately it's not that easy. As I said before, there's a lot of artists that were sort of, bouncing from one art movement to another art movement, or people that in and of themselves sort of spurred or spun a whole bunch of art movements out of their own particular creative activity. One of the artists that I have always been extremely inspired by is an artist named Robert Rauschenberg. Discussed him a little bit in terms of pop art, but he's also sort of instrumental in sort of kicking off what we'll know as minimalism. He sort of predated a little bit of that activity. In the 1950s, in the mid-50s, he was doing canvases where he would begin the process of doing a painting and then begin the process of removing it. He actually did a painting where he famously requested a piece of artwork by a famous artist named Willem de Kooning, and then basically went and slowly erased the entire canvas, erased the entire image. He did a whole bunch of canvases that he would eventually paint over with layers of white or layers of black or layers of red, and basically would take these images and deconstruct them. Now, some people would refer to it as sort of removing everything from the painting, and others would refer to it as simplifying the painting, and others would refer to it as creating a space for contemplation or meditation or something like that. Myself, I sort of end up looking at his work as sort of a continuum of reactivity, constantly reacting to what's going on. He often referred to himself as a neo-Dadaist, sort of being extremely interested in what artists like Marcel Duchamp were doing, but also a whole bunch of artists were quite inspired by the things that he was doing. One of the best things about these art centers is how inspiration flows from one person to another, and from one artist or group of artists to another. Minimalism, of course, is in some cases the exact opposite of pop art, but in other ways is an exact continuation of abstract expressionism and simplification of abstract expressionism to its core, to its simplest possible form. Now, again, it would be easy if I could say this guy started minimalism. To a certain degree, we could look at Robert Rauschenberg as having done something like that, but it is people reacting to pieces that he made and doing the next version or the next variation of it, the next, exploration from it. A number of other artists inspired by artists like Joseph Albers, who was a color theorist, somebody who studies aesthetics. He basically, a whole bunch of people that sort of learned from him started really sort of exploring, all right, I'm going to simplify this down to only a handful of colors, but each of the colors is going to have an absolute purpose, or each of the parts of this composition are going to be completely, very cautiously and carefully constructed. There were some sculptors and some painters who wanted to make sure that their images were so pure in their color that they had to be made by a machine. So pure in their relationship and size and scale and the way that they fit together that they absolutely had to be created by a machine, fabricated by a machine. Other artists, of course, played with very simplified color combinations, but wanted to explore some of the other basic constructs of art, which are things like, what is the shape of the canvas? What is the shape of the artwork that I'm looking at? What is the relationship between the wall, the frame, and the interior of the canvas? Can we make an image that uses the wall as a portion of the artwork? Is it possible to make an image where the frame is part of the image, if not is an integral part, if not the most important part of the image? You're going to see a number of artists that are going to pursue, again, playing the avant-garde card, sort of saying like, all right, what rules can I break? What rules have people just, not referenced yet? What artwork, what rules have people not broken yet? And let's break those rules, even though we're operating on a very, very narrow set of rules that we are going to follow. I tell you, this is going to sort of be, in some cases, what people refer to as the death of painting or the end of painting. But in other ways, it actually is the liberation of the individual artist away from the art movements, away from the art scenes, away from the individual, the collection of artists that sort of make up an art movement, to the idea that a collection of paintings by one painter becomes an art movement to a certain degree. And that's going to usher in the sort of next variation of modernism, the next variation of what some people will call postmodernism. Now, minimalism takes a lot of different forms. It's not just the blank white canvas or the blank black canvas, the Robert Rauschenberg piece that I was describing, but in some cases, it's a matter of still exploring with paint, still exploring with the surface, still exploring a lot of things inside of this. Robert Ryman, who's probably one of the more famous minimalists that are out there, who made a whole bunch of white paintings. He started as an abstract expressionist, but just chose to use only white paint, still playing with brushwork, still playing with mark making. Again, trying not to be pictorial, trying not to make pictures of things, but trying to make paintings which were objects that did have surface tension. He would take a blank white piece of paper and mask off the edges, and then paint it with shiny white paint. And end up with something where there is this really interesting surface tension between the ripped edges of the paper and the smooth, glossy surface of the interior portion of the painting. Frank Stella, another minimalist, he was probably most famous for playing with shaped canvases, giant T-shaped canvases or L-shaped canvases, but didn't limit himself to just white. Instead, he made a lot of things that were these sort of like arcs of color, variety of different colors. Again, not trying to represent something, but playing with shapes of color that were smooth, flat surfaces, sort of going back to Renaissance approach to the smooth canvas, but not rectangles, and not representing something, right? Choosing which rules to go back to and follow, choosing which rules to, of the contemporary painters to disregard, right? It's always interesting to look at any individual painter and see which rules they're choosing to follow, see which rules they're choosing to throw out, because that becomes the appreciable quality of their work. Again, not necessarily the fact that they do or don't resemble the Renaissance paintings, but instead which things they share in common with each of the different art movements that move down the line. I tend to find certain things in each individual artist that I really appreciate and that I'm interested in being inspired by, and other things in each individual artist that I really don't like, really don't care to even necessarily continue to discuss. I look at all of these painters for inspiration. I try to figure out what it is about their work that I can use and that I can bring into my world. It seems as though if I make pictures like this, the blank white canvases would be not the least bit tasty to me. I definitely like a great deal of color, and especially relationships between these very specific colors. If you look, that's sort of a bit of a theme in a number of the other works that I've got on this wall. But see, taste is not necessarily the most important question when I'm talking about art. Taste is one of these things that's really easy to argue because you're right. You like it or you don't like it. Somebody might be able to provide an argument that might change your mind, but it's probably not going to change your vision. You either visually like what's going on or you don't visually like what's going on. But see, that's the difference between retinal art and conceptual art. See, conceptual art is an argument that you could have with somebody and they might be able to convince you to change because it's not strictly whether or not it pleases or displeases the eye. Now, of course, the other interesting thing, and something that we haven't discussed very much yet this semester, is that not all art is necessarily designed for you to enjoy it visually or even conceptually. Let's take a moment and think about films, right? Are all films designed to be enjoyed? Yeah, perhaps on some level, but not necessarily in the same way. A romantic comedy and a slasher film, for instance, are not necessarily designed to be experienced or appreciated in the same way. You don't love a slasher film because it makes you feel good. You like a slasher film because it makes you tense and it makes you nervous and it makes you scared, right? Which is often considered to be a negative sort of feeling, right? Fear is not necessarily something that I generally do for entertainment. However, there are people that are entertained by fear, right? There are some people that are entertained by the academic experience that is this painting, right? It's a situation that I can appreciate this painting and really enjoy the fact that it exists without necessarily liking it. But strangely enough, I do like that. I do like that for a number of reasons. I like it for what it isn't. I like it for the fact that it's playing with tradition, and I like the fact that it's an avant-garde stab. It's a move in a direction that is intentionally anti-art in some ways, but is also, because we're playing art, is playing the game of art, following some of the rules of art, but intentionally cheating and playing and breaking other rules, right? Now, cheating in this case, I think, is sort of an interesting sort of move. In other words, the idea that we expect certain things out of our art, and this does not necessarily give us some of the things that we expect in our art. As I said before, this is not an image of somebody, you know, as was the rules in the Renaissance and even into the Baroque. This is not an image. We don't see interesting marks. We don't see interesting application of paint, which were the rules during the Impressionist era. We don't see interesting relationships of color and experiments in line and mark making, which were the rules during the abstract expressionist era. This isn't an image of an advertisement or an explosion of popular culture, which were the rules during the pop art movement. This is just color. It's a field of color. It's a field of a single color, and that gives us a very different sort of experience. Kind of like, if we sort of think of if we sort of think of the Impressionist painting as sort of a romantic comedy or a chick flick, this might be a slasher film to you personally. This might be a biopic to you personally. It might not be something that you enjoy, but it is something that's worth appreciating for what it is and for what it isn't.